Hello, I'm Professor Nick Cull from the University of Southern California, and my talk today is called Building Reputational Security, Rethinking South Korea's Public Diplomacy in the Post-COVID Era. And before I should begin, I should say how much I appreciate the invitation from the Korea Foundation, and that I wish that I was with you in person. So just an overview of what I want to say. I want to begin by talking about the moment of crisis that I see Korea and the world experiencing right now. Then I want to comment on the problems with the principal way of understanding public and cultural diplomacy that we've been using up till now, that is soft power, and problems I see with soft power as presently understood. I want to say a little about the way in which reputation can play a role in world affairs, and then focus on specific issues right now for South Korea. And the overall direction of what I'm saying is that I'm seeking to outline a path to what I call reputational security, and I'll explain what that is as we go along. I'll also talk about threats to that reputational security and argue that right now we're in a moment that I would call a reputational flux, when reputations on the international stage are vulnerable, but there are also opportunities for countries to build their reputations. And my conclusion is that it's a great time right now for South Korea to act, to reinforce its already impressive reputation. And a lot of the ideas in this talk come out of the conclusion to my book, Public Diplomacy, which I'm glad to say has just been translated into Korean. So first of all, our moment of crisis. Well, there are many contributing factors to our moment of crisis, not just the COVID-19 pandemic. First of all, we find media in crisis. Media around the world has been weaponized by hostile governments and hostile political parties. It's also, we find ourselves in a moment of technological transition, when audiences around the world are still getting used to social media and haven't yet really got a sense of how to evaluate information on that platform, and to are more susceptible to being manipulated in this new media than they were with the more familiar, older platforms of communication. I, as a historian, would say that every time a major new medium is introduced, we see tremendous political instability. And in fact, I believe that media instability, or new media instability, was part of the process that gave rise to the First World War, the Second World War, and certainly made the Cold War a lot worse. So I think it's a really serious situation to have this crisis around media. I would go so far as to say that seeing a population coping with a new medium is really rather like seeing a population coping with a new virus. They have no immunity to it, they're susceptible to it, and are much more disrupted by it than they would be when really familiar with it. Moving on from this, I believe that politics is in crisis right now. One of the reasons for this is that the problems of the world are simply too big for any single actor to resolve. We are seeing challenges in many parliaments around the world of gridlock, and we're seeing frustration in publics over this inability to address the really big problems. Diplomacy is in crisis too. The nation state seems to have lost credibility as a voice on the world stage, and people around the world can find what they need from people who are like themselves, on the social media platforms. So it's really hard for diplomats to speak to foreign audiences when necessarily they're not like those audiences. We're seeing around the world the rise of the public as a central factor in foreign policy, and this is why so many countries now have to pay attention to issues of media and, of course, soft power. But when I look at the theory of soft power, or the way that it's understood in the world today, I see problems. Of course, I can see that there was great value in Joseph Nye's initial articulation of the importance of attraction as a factor in power. The problem is that when we try to measure soft power, when we look at the countries that enjoy the most soft power, this restricts our focus on the biggest countries in the world, the strongest countries in the world. So Brand Finance looked at the top 10 soft power nations. Portland consultancy came up with the idea of a soft power 30. But if we're restricting ourselves to soft power 30, what does that mean for the other 170 countries? Are they the no power 170? I don't see that it's viable to really have a yardstick of international power that is restricted only to the largest countries. And yet, when we think about power, we find an inherent paradox. And that is, the more powerful a country is, even if that power is cultural power, the less sympathetic audiences tend to be. Think of the story in the Bible of the conflict between David and Goliath. Audiences are always sympathetic to the smaller, party, to the David in a David and Goliath contest. And surely this goes against the assumption of soft power that strength is admirable. Even strength based on virtue has its limits, I think. More than this, there is a negative that comes from seeking to attract attention in the world, directing attention to your own image and hoping that you will have influence. This is unattractive in people, and I think it's unattractive in countries too. The way I like to think about this is to quote the American song by Carly Simon. Now it must be nearly 50 years ago, when she sang of "You're so vain, you probably think this song is about you," showing up the vanity of actor Warren Beatty. You could say the same thing about certain countries that spend all their time talking about themselves, their unilateral virtues, and that I think to many around the world becomes tiresome and give it long enough, unattractive. The idea of soft power has been diluted in its meaning. It's come to mean many things to many different theorists and practitioners, and more than this, mean different things in different places. When Americans talk about the soft power of the United States, they tend to emphasize the wealth of the United States and its popular culture, Hollywood, for example. In China, the government emphasizes the Chinese language and the attractiveness of the Chinese economic system as a mechanism for rapid development. In India, soft power directs attention to the ancient culture and to the achievements of Indian people, including the Indian diaspora around the world. South Korea focuses in its conversation about soft power often on Hallyu, the Korean wave, and the admiration for Korea's popular culture around the world. So each of these major players in soft power is leading a slightly different conversation. But in all four cases, we see a neglect of the defensive aspect of soft power. An unwillingness to consider the way in which negative images, negative stories, negative happenings can diminish the soft power of a place. So I want to talk about this important element of reputation as a category of thinking about the image of countries in the world and the need to protect reputation. What can we say about reputation in world affairs? Well, in the first place, reputation is an ancient part of statecraft. It's something that the great leaders of the past sought to enhance their reputation, for example, through formal portraits and so forth. We know that the kings of the past sought to protect their honor and the honor of their country. They might even fight a war over something that seemed trivial, like an insult to a flag. And my argument would be that these insults to flags, insults to the honor of kings, were not trivial at all, but rather were symptomatic of an understanding of the importance of reputation as being preserved in a competitive environment. In international relations theory, when we've talked about reputation, it tends to focus on anticipating responses. So would country X have a reputation likely to bluff or likely to launch nuclear missiles if provoked? And yet reputation has to mean more than this. If you think about writing about national brands, that's all about multiple elements of reputation. Simon Anholt, in his work, has identified 6 components: tourism, exports, people, culture and heritage, governance, and investment and immigration, all important elements of reputation that go to create the national brand and determine the success or otherwise of a country on the international stage. I've found as a historian that reputation is particularly important at a moment of crisis. What's been instructive to me is this terrible moment in 1938 when Adolf Hitler in Germany threatens the relatively new country of Czechoslovakia. And the Allies have to decide whether they're going to defend Czechoslovakia or whether they're going to surrender the country to Hitler through a compromise. The British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, when he's explaining his decision to compromise, actually says explicitly to the British people how terrible it is to consider war for a place far away of whose people we know nothing. So he effectively says that because Czechoslovakia doesn't have a reputation for British people, Britain doesn't feel compelled to defend it in the same way that it might if it was a better known place. And indeed, we see Chamberlain reacts differently to threats to Poland the following year. He and the French issue a joint treaty guaranteeing the integrity of Poland. I think that this importance around reputation is recognized by hostile states in the current international environment, and you can see how quarrels around reputation have been very hard fought. I'm thinking here about the argument between China and Australia over education policy, or indeed about the way in which Russia has represented conditions in the Nordic countries, places with an excellent reputation that they have sought to undermine by creating an essentially false narrative identifying the Nordic countries with child molestation and child endangerment. So this is why I think we need to think about reputational security. But how does reputational security map onto conditions in South Korea? First, it's a way of saying that world opinion matters. Remember always that decisions made for domestic reasons are seen and understood abroad. The pandemic has meant that domestic policy, domestic medical approaches and administrative decisions are much more relevant to international audiences than they have been in the past. And in fact, I think the world has been impressed by what it has seen of South Korea's response to the pandemic. But remember, international audiences don't live in South Korea, and an achievement in this field of policy is actually of limited relevance to an international audience. Remember also, there are global standards and global expectations that are applied to all countries. And we see one excellent indicators for South Korea. Lots of evidence that there is a positive image, and an increasingly positive image, and a clear, slow upward trajectory year on year. Each year, South Korea placing a little higher in key indices like the Nation Brands Index run by Anhalt and Ipsos. Some special issues to be concerned about from the defensive aspect. One is social justice issues and gender issues. It's ironic that sometimes South Korean popular culture, which is appreciated in the world, will highlight South Korea's internal debates around gender and social justice. This was the case with the motion picture Parasite that did so well a couple of years ago. Political transparency is important. I remember maybe 10 years ago now when South Korea was making a great effort around developing its national brand, that treatment of foreigners was an issue. And it was particularly important to stress to South Koreans the need to show hospitality towards foreigners visiting or residing in South Korea. It's important to place value in culture, both old and new, but also to show and work with the diaspora, both the Korean diaspora internationally and foreign diasporas present in South Korea. I think that one of the things that the world is looking for right now and needs right now is the involvement in global citizenship. Investing, leading agencies like the United Nations, the World Health Organization, and so forth. One of the implications of the fact that our problems, the problems in the world, are too big for any one country, is that there is a positive reputation to be earned from the countries that show themselves willing and committed to cooperation. The countries that want to be part of a team solution, I think, will increasingly do better in world affairs than the countries that want to be the prima donna, seen to act unilaterally. So how can South Korea increase reputational security? Well, I believe for South Korea and for every country, it's time to consider what in the UK has been called a fusion doctrine. That is, understanding that soft power and public diplomacy are not an optional extra, but are an intrinsic element in the security of the state. When soft power speaks the language of security, it speaks the language of the treasury, of the holders of the budget in a country. I think it's important to understand that reputation doesn't only help countries. Sometimes it hurts. And so elements that are limiting or unappealing internationally need to be addressed. The relevance of the elements of culture you speak about are important. It's important that the things you choose to speak about are important to your international audience. We know from surveys that it's great if a country is rich or a country is strong, but a country being appealing and culturally relevant is even more important. One of the great strengths of South Korea in the US is its popular culture, but also food and martial arts have made a tremendous difference. More than this, the world is looking for ethical relevance, for countries that make a difference to the problems we share. A good image is a wonderful thing to have, but good images rest on a good reality. If South Korea wants to continue to be seen as a good country internationally, it needs to invest in building a good reality. And remember that a convincing story is a story with many sources, where there were many elements converging to build an impression of that good reality. So the best foundation, I think, is the kind of multi-sector partnerships that we often see in Korean cultural diplomacy. But we have to bring together cities, regions, non-governmental organizations, and artists all have an important part to play. There are plenty of threats to reputational security. External messages seek to undermine. We need to work together to rebuild the integrity of mass media, which is under attack all the time from disinformation and other disruptive influences. Internally, we see confusion and political hypocrisy undermining the integrity of messages in every country. And we also have to remember that South Korea, as every country, has genuine problems that need to be seen to be addressed. However, we must beware of a focus on the self and remember that our obsessions are not going to be the same things that international audiences are interested in. I think it's a time to seek out cooperation, to listen carefully to global responses, and remember that we are blind to our own biases. So as nations, including South Korea, look to develop their reputational security, it's important to work with allies and to think collectively, where can we do better? Where are our weaknesses? And sometimes there can be really interesting discussions around areas that some people see as a weakness. So my conclusion, South Korea's time to act. I think there's great hope in the attention we see right now being applied to reputation. We live in this era of global challenges. Obviously, we need global solutions. There's tremendous danger in a world where the media is weaponized. And certainly this is no era in which to attempt to go it alone and build a unilaterally strong international image. I'm encouraged by the strength South Korea is showing in international opinion and in global reputation. I think it has long-term advantages to continue to build on those successes. But we know that global reputation evolves very, very slowly. And so everybody involved in this project of building South Korea's reputation needs to show patience. I think that our idea about soft power, our idea about reputational security needs to change in one important way, and that's we have to broaden it slightly to include a concept of a collective reputational security. The damage to the reputation of one democracy actually hurts all democracies, because in this world we're all interlinked, and we have to think of the health of our economic system that we share, the health of the political system that we share, and to think, well, what can we do to help one another be more secure in our reputations? And so I hope there can be collaboration in this, and a collective discussion of public diplomacy is a great place to start. Because public diplomacy is an essential tool of the 21st century. It's not an optional extra anymore. And the first step in improving public diplomacy is, of course, to listen, and to listen to one another, to listen to the world. Thank you so much for your attention. If you want to contact me, my email is cull@usc.edu. I tweet as @NickCull, and I'm involved in a podcast called People, Places, Power, which goes out currently every week, and I do it with the British analyst Simon Anholt. So I hope that in future years I'll be with you in person. Thank you so much for your attention, and I hope the rest of Public Diplomacy Week goes really, really well. Thank you very much.